Hello, my name is Ben Stuke. I'm going to be covering some more advanced rendering techniques in Keyshot, just to give you some more insight into the material graph and a few other features to help you get better renders. So first I'm going to look at the leather material. In the material graph, this material is driven by one texture that's triplanar mapping. So triplanar is the same as box, but it basically fades the corners together so that there's no weird clipping on edges. So it's really useful for anything that's more round, but the texture looks better with a box map. This material is typically just this one specifically is a black leather, but I am editing it with a color and number to turn it to white so that I can color it easier. And then with the color adjust, I am using the colorize to make it a tan leather. So this color, you can change it to be whatever color you want. And it'll change the leather and map it across the leather texture, so I could change it to blue if I wanted to. And then it maps perfectly across there. Then I have it affecting the specular. So the same texture going into color to number, going into specular. So not much changed here, basically just lightened up everything. And the same thing for roughness, the same texture is controlling everything. So this way you don't have any issues with texture maps not lining up. You just have one texture controlling everything. And then I also have it combined with a bump add. So this bump add, just as it says, it just adds two bumps together. And you can choose the weight of each of them or the ratio. I normally just leave it at the default settings and change things within the actual texture themselves. If you need to have that texture driving more than one thing or more than one bump, then I would start messing with the weight or ratio, but it's harder to keep track of where the controls are and what's driving that texture. So this is just a noise texture to add some unevenness to the surface. And then we'll look at the radially brushed metal. So the radially brushed metal is being mainly driven by a grunge texture, which is this one over here. So this texture is applying the unevenness and imperfections to both surfaces. So there's two materials here. One is the logo, which is being driven by two images down here. And then the other one's the radial brush. So the radial brush is being controlled by brushed radial texture, which is a procedural texture in Keyshot. So for the radially brushed texture, there's a few different ways to map it. You can either use the arrows or turn it with the different axes, or you can use the position button, and that basically means that wherever you click, it moves the center. So you want to find where it is and then get it perfect. And then this texture is going through a color to number to basically flatten it mostly, because when you're using metals, any slight variation in the texture shows up a lot. And then it's being slightly colorized to the color I want, and then put into the diffuse. Then the grunge is controlling the specular, so adding just some unevenness around it, so some slight imperfections for more realism. And then the radial is controlling the roughness, which is key for a radially brushed material, is that it's in the roughness and the bump. And then as well, there's some unevenness in the bump being controlled by the grunge again. Then the grunge is also controlling the specular of the label, which is what's driving most of the actual color for the label. So if I change the colorize in the specular, it changes the color of the label. Then it is also driving the roughness, just to add unevenness again, but the bump and opacity are driven by custom textures that are just essentially the logo and the logo slightly blurred to add a more subtle bump that's not as intense. The next material we'll look at is actually the ground material. This material is very useful for not necessarily context shots, but more for wow shots if you want to add a reflection or have more control over your shadows. The shadow box does exactly what it says. It controls how it controls the shadows and how dark they are and what color they are. So if you want red shadows, you can make them red, but obviously that's not realistic. Specular is how intense the reflections are. So the brighter the specular, the more intense and visible the reflections are, and that works in tandem with refractive index, which is the same as every other refractive index on a material. It's a true value of a material. The higher it is, the more reflective it is. Roughness really controls the clarity of the reflection. So turning it up decreases clarity, lowering it increases clarity. So depending on what look you're going for, you'll want to mess with that. And then reflection contrast just makes the reflection pop more. And clip geometry below ground makes it so if there's any models that are actually below whatever this ground material is, it'll make them disappear. And now onto the lighting. So for this, I pretty much always set up my own lighting. For background, there's 4 options: color, gradient, sun and sky, and image. I typically just used gradient, and then I have a darker gradient going up to the top so that it gives some consistent lighting in the scene, because most places aren't actually completely pitch black if all the lights are out. So it just adds that base layer of light that's regularly there. And then I add in the other lights, normally one by one, to set up the scene and gradually tweak them. So the main settings in a light are radius, which is the size of it, color, which is the color of the light. I normally use the Kelvin scale because it's the temperature scale for light bulbs and just lighting temperature in general. So lower is warmer, higher is cooler. I try and stick closer to the middle unless you're doing something that's like outside. Then you obviously want to be warmer because the sun's temperature is warmer. Brightness is exactly what it sounds like. It's the brightness of the light. I would try and use this brightness value to adjust rather than using these. Like it's okay to use these values if you can keep track of these ones as well, but sometimes you can get lost trying to control both of them. Then fall off mode, I typically always set it to linear because it's more natural than from edge. So I find linear is the one that replicates a softbox for studio lighting more. Transforms is pretty simple. It's if you wanted to dial in the light position more. So azimuth is the X and Y direction of the light, and elevation is the Y, azimuth is the X. So moving it is the Y, that's the X. And then there's different ways to set up lighting. So there's silhouette lighting, which is basically just having the lighting around that makes the edges pop. And you have to consider what you're going to do for your lighting based off what product you have. So say, for example, something that had fuzz. The fuzz shows a lot better in silhouette lighting. And so it can really show off a material if you want to have the edges lit up because it shows the unevenness around the edge. And now I'll show the difference between different backgrounds and how you have to light them differently. So these are the exact same. The only thing that's different really is how intense the lighting is. So you'll notice the light is actually brighter with a white background, because if you had just the same lighting as black and then went and changed the color to a white, you'll notice it doesn't look exactly right. It's a bit too dark. So it's contrasting too much and it just doesn't look like it really belongs there because there's these random really dark edges when in reality light would be reflecting off the white and make the whole product brighter. So that's why if you want a different background, you should adjust the lighting environment to suit it so that it doesn't look like it's off. And yeah, the HDRI editor is really powerful for having a bunch of different lighting options, and you should use pins and that to get it set up. Never use startup environment. And also for pins, if you don't want to use azimuth or elevation, you can always use the crosshair, which is just click to choose where you want to put a light. And that's it.